Okay, I think we can begin. Welcome everyone to our Law Tech Talk here hosted by the Law and Technology Center. I am Marcelo Thompson. I teach here at the Faculty of Law in the area of Law and Technology, Regulation of Technological Platforms. And I'm most excited to welcome our speaker for today's talk, Mr. Bulelani Jili, who is joining us right now from Kenya, where he is conducting his research. Mr. Bulelani is currently in Kenya, but he is finalizing his doctoral work as a PhD fellow at Harvard University, where he focuses on Africa-China relations and issues in this realm from a technological perspective, issues concerning cybersecurity, development, ICT development, internet policy, business law more generally, law and development, and privacy law. Bulelani is also a visiting fellow at Yale Law School, a fellow at the Atlantic Council, a cybersecurity fellow at the Belfer Center, and he's conducting his research in affiliation also with the China Law Development Project at Oxford University. I see Mr. Bulelani has a much more extensive CV, which you can surely find online with reference to his work. But I think this is hopefully a good introduction already to his work and areas of interest. Bulelani is going to be talking to us about surveillance initiatives in Africa, casting a different light on the topic and explaining the dynamics that underpin the adoption of surveillance tools in China. The title of his talk is A Technological Fix: The Adoption of Chinese Digital Surveillance Products in Africa. So Bulelani is going to speak for, let's say, 40-45 minutes or a bit less, depending on how much he wants to extend the discussion. But then we are going to open for discussions with the audience, and I'm very thankful for all of you who are joining us today. And I will ask you to please feel free to send your questions on the chat for us to engage with them later on. So without further ado, let me give Bulelani a warm welcome. Thank you very much for joining us, Bulelani.
Thank you so much for having me. Firstly, I would like to kind of thank all the organizers of the event, those who are within the law school and beyond the law school. And I would also like to extend my appreciation to the audience members who are willing to take time out of their day to participate in today's discussion. And as stated already, that I greatly welcome all questions, both novel and also old, as we kind of really attempt to kind of really dissect the general nature of the distribution of Chinese surveillance technologies into the global South. In summary, today's argument and really contention is interested in exploring both the proliferation, but also the adoption of Chinese surveillance tools in African countries. I'll be mostly relying on kind of two cases, Kenya and Ethiopia. And the trends of this proliferation, I argue, really are contingent on three factors: China's diplomatic strategy in the global South, its technological ambitions, and the kind of growing corporate reach and power of China's major technological firms. And lastly, but most importantly, African domestic demand factors. And so in some sense, you could argue that both supply and demand factors are really contributing to the proliferation and then adoption of surveillance tools. And today's discussion is then really organized around three main points that I would like to kind of get across. Firstly, the reasons behind the driving of the adoption of digital infrastructure, including surveillance technologies, is really contingent on the particularities of local environments, which will be further explored in the discussion. And then also how exactly these systems are being employed by state and sub-state actors. So how exactly, Kenyan authorities, South African or Ethiopian authorities are going about adopting and then applying these systems will kind of come out clearly. And then lastly, what are some of the local challenges that emerges from the adoption of these systems, particularly in kind of legal environments that are not necessarily prepared both for the mass scale of surveillance, which then kind of engender domestic challenges around both data protection and privacy. And so to be clear, this talk focuses on the procurement and adoption of systems. It does not presume the party state's exceptional nature in the distribution of surveillance tools or seek to obfuscate the broader international market for surveillance tools and cyber intrusive systems, which involve multiple Western and non-Western actors. Rather, this inquiry into the proliferation of Chinese public systems, in some sense, is really an attempt to understand both the party states and kind of private firms' geopolitical footprint in the global South. And much of Beijing's kind of significant foreign policy activity is now taking place on the continent. And in my broader work, I actually argue that Africa in many ways is functioning as the theater or the training ground for an emerging superpower, and drawing attention to Chinese activity on the continent in some sense might give us a prognosticating mechanism to think more carefully about how China will conduct foreign policy more broadly as things continue. And so accordingly, this investigation into the spread of digital surveillance tools in Africa then offers us a grounded sense for making examinations into how the party states, both ambitions and corporate firm activities, are entangled and are critically, in many ways, mediated by local state and sub-state actors. And so the talk, and more broadly, my work, then aims to expand and extend our understanding of kind of local and global risks that come with the adoption of these systems, while providing really greater insights into the kind of client decision-making processes, which I believe is kind of critically understudied and examined in the kind of general literature. And I should also preface this general comment on the general nature of current discussions around Chinese surveillance tools. Really, I'd say across the literature, but also in some key policy discussions, the general predilection is to presume Chinese intentions around the application and adoption of systems in the global South. Those discussions, I think, are keenly marked with presumptions about notions of backdoor access or a kind of grand strategy that is interested in further diminishing, say, US influence in the global South. And so while those are kind of key presumptions that my work speaks against and alongside it, it's not directly challenged or worked through within this presentation. But if people wish to have a kind of more clinical examination into those kind of presumptions, I open it up as a possibility of discussion, specifically in the Q&A. But the presentation thus far is, in some sense, about grounding our discussion in local context. So that way, we can, in some sense, align our facts and then kind of have a more robust theoretical discussion later. And so, in some sense, the size and then the scope of this talk, does not, in many ways, permit an exhaustive review of the global ecosystem of surveillance systems and proliferation. Instead, as indicated, primary attention is given to both the spread and then the adoption of these systems in local contexts. And the example of Kenya has been precisely selected to help explore how China's growing cyber footprint is mediated by local state actors, and how China's diplomatic engagement and corporate expansion is consistently in dialectical relation with the local. The case of Kenya in particular has been selected not simply because of the fact of much of my work being conducted in Kenya. It's that Kenya has thus far received the largest number of ICT loans from Beijing. In fact, Kenya and Ethiopia, the last 3 decades, in fact, have received consistent attention as relates to ICT development from Beijing. And so they become the easiest places both to trace the involvement of Chinese firms, but also of the parties' involvement in the supporting of developmental initiatives around the intersections of development and ICT. What is also most interestingly is that both of them also offer us an interesting contrast of political and legal systems. Kenya is considered to be, a relatively healthy democracy, juxtaposed to Ethiopia, who has a more kind of closed system. And it is that diversity of political systems that also then helps us to think more carefully about exactly how Beijing engages with the local in contrasting political environments. And more importantly, I believe that the talk, in some sense, is both a commitment and an emphasis on kind of African volition, recognizing its salience as a way to kind of go beyond both myopic representations, both of Africa as a passive recipient and partner in Africa-China relations. And so the kind of inquiry is really about trying to find activity where it's been consistently underlooked or overlooked or simply ignored. So when we are looking at current work, and this includes media coverage, most discussions about the distribution of Chinese surveillance tools and cyber capability platforms consistently, scrutinizes China's diplomatic activities, and would then ask us questions about the degree to which the party state, with the aid, of course, of private firms, which is a presumption, enables digital autocratic practices across the global South. These accounts, speculate on the level of coordination between Beijing and its corporate actors, while the degree of coordination cannot be empirically fixed or established. Financial incentives in the form of loans and aid are used to support African state procurement and the proliferation of surveillance tools. And so a majority of the general discourse around this space consistently uses loans as the leverage point, but also the beginning point of how to understand Beijing's influence in the context of Africa, but more broadly, actually, across the global South. And so accordingly, several interconnected economic policies and initiatives that help Chinese firms gain overseas infrastructure development experience are also primary sites of consideration. Obviously, the most prominent one is the Go Out strategy of 1995, and much of the general literature also focuses on this point as another point of considerable consideration when we're thinking about Beijing's consistent activity across the global South. Obviously, this policy in particular was really about surplus capital being lent abroad to create novel commercial opportunities for Chinese firms. And the goal of assisting the internationalization of domestic firms was in part about improving Chinese brand recognition globally, easing fierce domestic competition, and then exploiting commercial opportunities made available in part by the absence of US investment in Africa. And so the kind of the time horizon for this, for people to really consider, is really from about 1995 to really honestly to the years of the early years of the Trump administration, which had a kind of really a pragmatic shift in terms of US policy on Africa, where they moved away from aid to trade, which was the kind of the tagline of the Trump administration, and the kind of the Biden administration has really continued with this line, and in some sense has tried to say that we will now be consistently competing with China on the African continent, which, you know, foreshadows generally a heating Cold War between kind of both international stakeholders, which again, you know, it's worth kind of dissecting, and, you know, I hope to kind of expect some questions around that line in the kind of the Q&A. And so, you know, while China's surveillance systems are mostly, you know, confined to its national borders, the private firms then make its surveillance architecture possible, are selling some of these tools to an African customer base. More specifically, you know, firms like Huawei have initially worked to expand internet connectivity in a country like Kenya. But in 2014, they also began selling their smart city products. And so Huawei's initial involvement in Kenya, as already stated, began simply with internet connectivity activities, which is really something of the early 2000s. At the time, Kenya didn't have a significant degree of connectivity, and Huawei was able to provide some of the kind of fiber optic cable infrastructure that was necessary to begin the digitization process of the Kenyan market, and then consistently provided support both at the level of both software and then later on, firstly with hardware and then later on software. And now, you know, Huawei has consistently provided infrastructure like cloud infrastructure, which has become really the kind of the linchpin of much of the kind of the Kenyan e-government initiatives. And so proponents, you know, of this move argue that, you know, public security systems, particularly in the context of Kenya, provide vital intelligence to authorities while also acting as a kind of deterrent to kind of criminal activity. And so that's the general line of reasoning behind the adoption of smart city surveillance systems in the context of Kenya. That is stakeholders both at the level of the nation state, but also sub-state actors, mostly at the city level. Again, what is usually lost in some of these general discussions is that procurement is taking both at the national level, but also at subnational levels, mostly at the city level, where majority of these systems are being adopted and then installed. And so if you listen to the voices of, say, people like Adam Lane, who's the Deputy CEO of Government Affairs at Huawei Kenya, he consistently echoes this general sentiment by contending, and here I quote, "Authorities can now conduct parametric video surveillance of Nairobi's urban center, as well as maintain a highly agile command and dispatch setup that runs on satellite-based GPS and software-based geographic information systems," end quote. And so yet, this sanguine outlook does not account for some of the real risks of exacerbating established problems like the misuse of public security systems and debt stress levels. These are obviously two really kind of key issues at the local level. At one level, there's been consistent documentation of the exploitation of public security systems, specifically against kind of political dissidents. That example is not heavily featured in the context of Kenya, but is in its neighboring countries, including Ethiopia and Uganda. And another obviously paramount general issue is the level of debt stress levels. Obviously, it's not been particularly covered yet in this talk, but I definitely open it up to kind of conversations in the Q&A. Debt between Africa and China, in some sense, has now become one of the kind of key thread lines of discourse. And Kenya, like almost every other African country, has a level of debt that is, in some sense, both worrying, but has also been a general feature of its relations, both between the global north and south, but also now between a south-south kind of relation. And so, continuing with the talk, surveillance tools, in some sense, in the context of Kenya, are then really enlisted by the Kenyan government primarily as a means to kind of scale public security capabilities, national security prerogatives, and then data security. The adoption of surveillance tools is made possible through the sale of Chinese equipment and soft loans from the China Exim Bank, which are crucial in making the public security platforms both financially reachable for Nairobi, as well as for other African governments, including Uganda and Ethiopia. And so beyond, companies like Huawei, Chinese companies like Dahua, Hikvision, and others are also involved in the adoption of digital surveillance systems in Africa. And what is quite clear is that much of Africa's surveillance systems are not, a commitment of simply coordination, say, between Huawei and Beijing, but rather they're a hodgepodge assemblage of multiple kind of systems that are being procured from multiple private vendors. And in 2012, the Kenyan government, for example, awarded Nanjing Information Technology, which is a kind of a high-tech provider that offers urban traffic management and urban governance tools, a tender to supply digital surveillance cameras. The goal of this initiative, again, was to augment public security and intelligent traffic management systems in downtown Kenya. And according to official figures, the platform cost the government about $3.8 million US, the initial date of completion was about 2013. However, due to delays, the project was only completed in April 2014. Constant power shortages and access to privately owned buildings for installation purposes were the cardinal reasons for delays. No less important, the adoption plan for these tools did not include corresponding data protection measures to promote and maintain privacy rights. Rather, inadequate planning was done really before the start of the program, which presaged the delays and then the data policy omissions. And so while Chinese firms promise a technological fix to traditional problems like, say, public safety and state security, which is made most evidently clear in some of the promotional materials that they hand over to their kind of African government counterparts, they really underdeliver in those areas. More pronouncedly, journalistic investigations and digital rights organizations have consistently raised concerns about cybersecurity threats, digital surveillance, and biometric data collection by these Chinese surveillance tools. These groups contend that the ubiquitous and under-regulated use of these technologies in the context of Global South really threatens privacy rights. And needless to say, the adoption of digital tools without robust institutional checks and balances, they believe renders citizens more vulnerable to state surveillance and suppression. And it is this gap between the novel digital technological adoption and regulatory frameworks of adoption that then creates the emergence of risks. A point, that I hope to kind of further elaborate on as, both as the talk continues, but also as a part of the Q&A, because that's really where some of my most salient work, I believe, is really tracking, which is the gaps between the adoption of systems and the absence of kind of regulatory frameworks currently available in the context both of Kenya, but also other Global South countries. And so China's, oversized role in kind of Africa's ICT market engenders a dependency on their products and expertise. If you're looking really continentally, for example, about 70% of Africa's ICT infrastructure capabilities is built by Huawei alone. And then the rest of the involvement is really from other kind of Chinese private firms. And so, digital public security systems are embedded within state-driven processes that are kind of contingent on some of these kind of public-private ventures. They arrive under the banner of digital development. And in some sense, they're really a continuation of an already established trend of ICT development projects across the Global South, but in this case, in particular, in Kenya. And the use and effectiveness of these tools, though nominally operated by and for the purposes of the Kenyan government, are heavily reliant also on Chinese contractors to operate the public security platforms. In fact, an audit done in 2018 by the Auditor General's Office found that senior staff sent over by the Kenyan government to China to learn how to operate some of these public security systems in fact, did not acquire the necessary training. Instead, the staff spent time inspecting the parts of the system to be delivered. And during that visit, no attempts were really made to learn or teach how to operate the system. And for this reason, questions remain about Kenya's means to operate and maintain its public security systems. And what is more, the technical matters having to do with the upkeep of the system are then also managed by contractors. The National Police Commission, who are tasked with the responsibility of operating the system here locally, had not developed really the capacity to even work the control room. And so to exacerbate these matters, the manual language of the control room was in fact in Chinese in the early years. And most kind of Kenyan civil servants, use English as usually the kind of language of general instruction. And so most of the digital surveillance cameras installed within, say, Nairobi's central business district have also stopped working months after they were installed. And what is even more worrying is that there were limited security protocols for accessing the system. This unfortunate circumstances then also increased the possibility of unauthorized access or the launching of malicious code on the server by unwarranted users. And so these are some of the really current challenges with this system here. And so the lack of evidence that proves the public security system's ability to truncate crime does not deter the promotion of the public security platform thus far in Kenya. For example, just using the example of Huawei again, they've installed about 9,000 cameras or so in the CBD area of Nairobi, which supports about 195 police stations. And yet within those given areas of the adoption of those systems, crime rates have kind of continued to rise. And so really there's no way in which one could, in the most simple sense, really draw a direct correlation between the adoption of public security systems and the reduction of crime. Yet you do see a growing nature of general challenges in the procurement of these systems. And so in fact, in the case, of Kenya, but also, in the case of other African countries, this has become, say, an obvious trend, at least to some of us who are, carefully looking into some of the general crime data that's being made available by the National Police Services. I've consistently tried to ask actually the National Police Services if they're willing to have an interview about this general challenge, and they've generally kind of refused to kind of have a conversation about it. But Adam Lane, again, the Deputy CEO of Government Affairs at Huawei Kenya, has consistently circumvented some of these concerns by simply contending that Huawei, quote, Huawei's role is to develop, install, deploy, and maintain the technology according to the requisite and request of the National Police Service. And the National Police Service is responsible for operating it and using it according to their policies, which are in line with the national law, end quote. This framing, I argue, is rather reductive, if not completely misleading. It rests somewhat simplistically on an all or nothing approach to the responsibility of challenges and some negative outcomes of the adoption of these systems. The argument obviously draws attention to the behavior of the national police, which I think is important, and some of my above comments have already, but it really says nothing about the consequences of the sale of these systems or whether regulations are necessary to mitigate negative outcomes. Although it is obviously true that the adoption of these systems has scaled the state's capabilities both to surveil citizens, but also to target citizens. And so I believe that this frame then really obfuscates systematically some of the activities that companies have been involved with and doing on the ground, and also simply then blaming the National Police Service while not necessarily also looking into how some of the general challenges are also connected with their own kind of personal activity on the continent. And so in thinking about some of the local challenges, I would, like to, spend some time thinking about some of the data protection laws that are currently available in the context of Kenya. Kenya currently has a Data Protection Act, really since 2019. And then there was a data commissioner who was then later installed in 2020. And really, the Data Protection Act aims to manage and protect data once it is acquired, processed, and stored. The country's constitution sees privacy obviously as a fundamental right. And as it stands, there are no kind of clear regulations as to how, for example, Kenya's biometric databases or facial recognition technologies will be used or how the data will be vetted. There are no means to audit the algorithms that empower the facial recognition technologies that have been installed across the city and including the airports. And in November, the appointment of the data commissioner has not resulted in the consistent rollout of means of regulating some of the both kind of digital and non-digital surveillance cameras that have been installed across Nairobi. And so thus far, it seems as though that there are no real clear plans to deal with the growing nature of surveillance. And, this lack of clarity, but also really the absence of auditing these surveillance systems only then generally exacerbates some general anxieties about the use of these surveillance systems by local stakeholders. And the growing adoption, I'd argue, of Chinese surveillance tools, both in Kenya, but more generally on the continent, and the US's ambition to mitigate the general spread of these tools, I believe, is in some sense encouraging a general bifurcation of the world and in some sense staging Africa and the global South generally as a theater for a dispute between China and the US. This general division between what I call procurers and non-procurers of Chinese surveillance systems does not actually support US interest or really the health and inclusive posture of the international liberal order. It crucially further ignores also the real political challenges and financial motivations behind the procurement of some of these systems, as are already highlighted. The primary reasons for their procurement in the context of, say, Kenya, is really for the promotion of, at one level, dealing with traditional challenges like crime and terror, and then at the more broader level, some of the digital infrastructure gaps that marked the very beginning of the digitization of the economy. And this particular point, this particular last point that I made, I believe suggests that international observers can then not afford really a parochial approach and message to the risks posed by some of these technologies. The message shared with the world must, in some sense, speak to, some of the challenges confronting African leaders and partners, and working with African authorities to build digital infrastructure and implementing data protection measures and addressing some of the kind of traditional challenges like crime is definitely one way people can kind of go forward. And policies, I believe, that meet local stakeholders, specifically local global South stakeholders, is critical in kind of making inroads and making changes. And I will try and at least end, this talk on this one final note, and then, I hope, there are questions in abundance. In giving, an intelligible account of China's expanding geopolitical footprint, it is salient to underscore party state ambitions and activities in Africa, while also illuminating how these aims are mediated by, local state and sub-state actors. Digital surveillance tools on the continent are consistently enlisted as a way to kind of ameliorate social challenges and developmental challenges, but also they're a way to index and catalyze development. And indeed, while these ambitions on the surface are very laudable by African governments, without the kind of requisite checks and balances, these systems seem to consistently pose risks to civil liberties, particularly in a region that is consistently struggling with challenges at the intersections of governance, policing, and crime. And so I argue that work must then be done to drive the maturation of legal measures to mitigate some of the negative consequences that are clearly a derivative of the intensification of surveillance practices that are connected to domestic ambitions. While simultaneously, it is also important to kind of have a more proportional posture to how global and local forces are mediating and creating an outcome that is exacerbating traditional challenges on the continent. So I leave it there, and I hope to have some more of a lively discussion with some of you.
Okay, thank you so very much. I really enjoyed your presentation and the more complex landscape that you have outlined there that explains the more simplistic account that we often find, both in relation to Africa's demands and concerns and in relation to China's international ambitions and intentions. And I would be more than happy to entertain questions by the audience, and I would really encourage you all to please ask your questions in the Q&A box so that we can see them and address. But while I wait for you, I will kick off our discussions here with some questions to Bulelani. Bulelani, I really enjoyed your presentation. And the first thing that I would like to know from you is the following. Not in our approaches to the topic, we tend to think of African countries as developing countries. But the assumption, on the other hand, seems to be that China is the developed one. China is a fully developed global power. Whereas the reality is also more complex in this respect. And you have outlined there are many challenges that local regulatory systems face in relation to how projects don't work well, the absence of a fully developed regulatory landscape, for instance, in relation to privacy and data protection. And you explained how the US is just coming into this whole scenario with a different approach now, treating questions as a matter of trade than rather than simply as aid, seeing that there is the need to outcompete China in its relations with Africa. This has been going on, though, for a while from a Chinese perspective, engagement with African countries. And what we see in the past years is that in China itself, only more recently, we have had developments in the privacy area, for instance. Only now we have a data protection landscape fully in place. And in other areas as well, right? Algorithmic regulation and e-commerce laws, right? These are all recent constructions in China. The rule of law as it is today is a more recent phenomenon in China, and is a more nuanced one in China as well, as we understand. Now, in your view, does this help to explain, in part, why the offering of these services to attend local demands, which, as you explained very well, is not only a national thing, it's multifaceted, right? It comes from the national level, from the local level, and from public and private actors as well. But can the absence of a regulatory landscape, of course, be explained in part from African countries' own development trajectories and the fact that there's still a lot of work to be done? But can it also be explained in part by the absence of the very possibility that Chinese companies or the Chinese government itself could offer a model to inspire, to provide justifications and a framework for African countries to implement policies in this regard as well?
Sure, for sure. I completely agree that in some sense, the absence of robust regulatory environments is really simply contingent in part because of the general state of countries, African countries' developmental, place, but also they themselves have not necessarily, really thought through some of the general kind of outcome and consequences of the general procurement of these systems. And so in some sense, it's about, the developmental stage. It's also in part because Chinese, stakeholders themselves, have not necessarily advocated for regulation, although funny enough now, in some of the most recent meetings that I've been able to attend, they have been actually speaking about the necessity of kind of data policies. But also, I would argue, on more generally, this is not a general unique feature, even in the context of the United States, algorithmic regulation, for example, is something that's new. I was literally sitting on a conversation about kind of AI regulation in the context of the United States this very week. And so in some sense, one can't, give a unique attribution to this particular challenge to China or Africa or the United States. My work in particular in part is interested in the gap between regulation and adoption, in part because I think it creates an unnecessary challenge for African countries who are interested in an inclusive development, while simultaneously that general gap, for some odd reason, also seems to be a consistent launch pad for other kind of inquiries, specifically inquiries that presume Chinese intentions in development in the context of Africa. That general gap for, say, the cybersecurity community in the United States uses it as a way to presume Chinese intention about, say, malice intention about, exacerbating, civil liberties as a way to promote what is believed to be kind of, democratic backsliding. That is kind of the prominent line of discourse in the context, both of kind of the American media, but also in the context of some policy spaces within the context of the US. And so that gap for me, in some sense, is both important to kind of understand locally, while simultaneously also to realize that that gap, in some sense, is also really a phantasmic image that's structuring discourse in the context of the United States. And that's kind of important to kind of really work through as to why does it have so much inertia in the kind of American public imagination.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? If not, I'm going to keep asking here. Would anyone like to type something? If you do, please feel absolutely free. We really welcome your questions. This presentation, our discussion here, has focused on surveillance and concerns with surveillance, concerns with the idea that the intentions of China may be to export an authoritarian model of governance, even though, as you highlighted, different countries in Africa are then conflated perhaps in a unidimensional approach that sees all them, right, as seeking to absorb these same practices, where the political environments, as you note very well, are so diverse between countries themselves. And the idea of surveillance, on the other hand, is not something that is and needs to be necessarily approached from a dimension of authoritarianism. Surveillance is at the very origins of the modern nation state. You cannot have state building if you don't have any form of surveillance practices in place. You give example of law enforcement practices. It is a necessity that surveillance technologies are in place. So perhaps the great question to be asked, it's a question of extent, of proportionality, which you know very well, of what practices are acceptable or not acceptable from both public and private actors. We are just seeing this week, this past week has been a busy one with the introduction of artificial intelligence tools, right, being made available to the public. And as we use those technologies, we are lending ourselves to this universe, right, releasing our personal attributes there, and reinforcement learning processes in machine learning. They depend on the evaluation of feedback, or on the appraisal of feedback authority. How people interact with the system and how the system learns depends basically on the evaluation of the inputs. And all these, we're seeing the development, and this is just like, right, we're just poking our faces there at this whole new universe which is unfolding here, and this is just the beginning of something very, very large that will be developing from now on, which is a reality where the private sector as well, and the private sector developed economies are not only shaping how the systems are going to unfold, but also shaping how our identities are expressed within and recognized within these systems, which is a much larger issue of surveillance as well, right? To what extent do you see issues of surveillance as a necessity that African countries generally have to put in place practices to develop their own communities, to ensure order in ways that Western countries, right, have relied on for the development of their own systems as well?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely kind of hear that, and I think I could maybe answer it in kind of a two-pronged approach. I'd say definitely, firstly, if one is thinking about surveillance as a modernist invention, one can trace it, really all the way back to the invention of the general modern prison, which functions in some sense as a place both of incarceration, but also as a place to make social observations of prisoners as a means to ensure both correction and social intervention. And that is, a general argument that is kind of found within kind of Foucauldian literature quite consistently, right? That the emergence of surveillance as an instrument of correction and discipline is in part and parcel about a modernist project, a pursuit of ever correction, but correction contingent in part and parcel on surveillance. And so that general kind of literature in itself is generally suspicious, both of not necessarily surveillance, but of correction, right? So the normative making of human behavior as the centrality of, say, Foucauldian scholarship. And much of my own personal work, in some sense, is really interested in giving a genealogy of surveillance. So, it moving from effectively a place of, social correction, or at least a means of social correction, all the way to now where it's really at the center of kind of economic activity. Obviously, at the kind of the current age, surveillance is really about, once again, and probably Foucauldians wouldn't be surprised, but how in some sense is really about training us on both how we understand our own wants, but also how the system, at least how the algorithm, can also help us discover our own wants. And so in that sense, surveillance has consistently functioned as a way of correcting, or at least socially intervening in the making of human behavior and activities. The difference is that it kind of moved from the social to the more economical. And so now we kind of really have to kind of take a more kind of critical inventory of how, surveillance in particular structures our economic activity. And, there's a series of kind of plethora of examples that now within some kind of, I'd say more in the kind of economic anthropological literature that's really kind of interested in how, products like, Siri or Amazon Home are in a dialectical relationship between ourselves and the product, and how in some sense, us sharing our wants and our tastes is in some sense training the product to train us on how to go about making consumption. And so when in some sense we're in a dialectical relationship between the product and ourselves, and that is central, and then in some sense trying to think more carefully about the proportionality of surveillance in the context of Africa. and I probably should have maybe stressed this ever more in my presentation. For example, the Kenyan government goes about procuring Huawei's kind of safe city product in 2014. And this is right after one of the largest kind of terrorist kind of acts in Kenya in 2013. A very popular and kind of highly commercial mall was attacked by an Islamic terrorist group that killed about 69 people. And so the government, in some sense, wanted to kind of expand its surveillance capabilities to really kind of keep track both of crime and terror activities on the continent. And so, in the country, and in kind of individual African countries have taken on surveillance really as an instrument to kind of correct for crime and terror. And so, the activity of surveillance within that context seems warranted. And I bet that most particular people don't necessarily flinch at the idea of surveilling for the sake of public security. What I particularly point to is that these ambitions of surveillance are actually not supporting public security. Or at the very least, the surveillance systems that have been procured thus far seem not to be supporting some of those ambitions. And so the failure of those systems, to me, renders more interesting questions about the nature of the procurement of these systems, while simultaneously the acts of unwarranted surveillance is really not connected to African governments, right? The discourse is usually saying China is doing the unwarranted surveillance. And so in that sense, how one empirically establishes unwarranted surveillance from the party is at one level a methodological question. At another level, it's a part of kind of consistent speculative exercises within the policy realm to kind of justify, general policy postures on the party. But that general kind of speculation, I consistently say, it doesn't necessarily in any way negate local activities and wants. So, for example, some of my own personal work with kind of local stakeholders here in Kenya has really been about bolstering cybersecurity capabilities and also privacy capabilities, regardless of whether there is warranted and unwarranted surveillance from other national actors. And so, attribution to me seems to be the linchpin of speculation, but also really not necessary for kind of local actors who are interested in promoting privacy and civil liberties.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate your presentation and your answers now. And we have one final question here, which I think speaks to the points that you were engaging with right now on whether countries are afraid of leaking data to China using their surveillance tools. I think that plays within the broader set of concerns that we see internationally, and which your presentation tends to shed a more complex light on. Just one brief point before I leave it to you to answer. I totally agree with your articulation of the question of surveillance there in the light of the panopticon, in the light of the literature on Foucault and Foucault's work himself, and the idea that surveillance doesn't need to be seen purely as a form of discipline, but increasingly surveillance is also something that it becomes a necessity to enable autonomy as well, to enable development, to enable people to organize their societies and alter their own lives. And increasingly, this recursiveness, this dialectic that you talk about between the individual and technology, is also a dialectic between the public and the private. And as we see the private increasingly, the private realm, the private domain, increasingly acquiring power in ways that challenged national orders and the governance of our societies, it's not possible to think that we can respond to these developments without developing at the same time capabilities to deal with them that entail some degree of acquisition of technological tools and powers to address challenges which are mounting challenges and which are just beginning. But let me just defer to the point here, and then we come back to the question, and then we come back just to wrap up because we are a bit beyond our time. Would you like to answer this concern that has been expressed here that local companies and countries may be afraid with that their data may be leaked through the use of Chinese technologies?
For sure. You know, this is a kind of a serious and paramount issue, and there are, you know, some examples in Africa that kind of greatly illustrate this point. A couple of years ago, the African Union found, you know, bugs in some of the, you know, cloud infrastructure that they procured, both from Huawei and other kind of Chinese technological companies, which directly pointed to, you know, a leakage of data flowing back directly to China. And so that point stands. The general issue is when it moves beyond from this one example to a presumption of kind of systematic kind of presumptions of consistent data leakages. And then from data leakages, then connecting it to a presumption of coordinated efforts between kind of Chinese private firms and kind of the party state. And so while, you know, much of my work in particular is interested in really establishing, say, you know, African volition and local activities as relates to the adoption of these systems, you know, I don't necessarily lose sight of the fact that like some challenges do emerge from it. And some of the challenges are at the level of simply gaps locally, whilst maintaining some of the general challenges of, you know, of a cybersecurity nature. And as I've already stated that, like, you know, in addressing this general challenge, attribution is not necessary, but it is necessary in the realm of kind of foreign policymakers who are interested in how do we necessarily then respond to, you know, a state who we believe to be systematically surveilling others. You know, whether it's systematic is something that is not necessarily empirically available to us thus far. It might actually never be empirically available to us. And so much of kind of both the intersection of both foreign policy, but also kind of cyber strategy globally then needs to be able to act in the absence of attribution. And, you know, some of my own general consulting work specifically with, say, you know, American stakeholders within the space has been about, well, what does it look like to develop a foreign policy strategy and posture that doesn't necessarily need attribution. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there unless the person is not satisfied. You know, we can further kind of excavate some of my responses.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We benefited immensely from your presentation and discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to thank as well the participants for joining us and for sticking with us until the end. And Bulelani, I really look forward to welcoming you to Hong Kong and to continuing our conversation. I wish you all the best in the continuation of your projects there in Kenya, and I very much look forward to seeing you soon. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye. Thank you.